Hello. Hello. I think everyone is here. Oh. That's a good reminder for me to put my phone on silent for the next little while. Hello. Right. So, today, obviously, as you probably noticed, we're starting a little bit early, and believe it or not, we'll probably also be finishing slightly early, because I do have a prior engagement. I have places I need to be at 8 o'clock UK time, which means I need to leave here by at least 7:30 UK time. It's currently 5 o'clock UK time, so we're probably looking at about 2.5 hours or so of streaming. So, with that in mind, it's probably a good thing that I should get on with, the actual answering questions part, which is presumably what everybody's here for. So, as before, we are going to answer the Patreon alternate history what if style questions first. If I can get this thing to work, which I apparently can, and then we'll go through any questions from chat in the time that's left to us, which as I say is going to be about probably 2.5 hours total, starting about now. So the first question is Sir Reginald Lee IV. The year is 1885. You are the naval attaché for Dom Pedro II, Emperor of Brazil, and you have been tasked with increasing the power of the Brazilian Navy through the acquisition and conversion of the largest ship in the world, the SS Great Eastern. With the blessing of the Emperor and the full might of the Brazilian naval budget, how would you go about converting Brunel's Great Eastern into an unstoppable juggernaut one-ship battle fleet to sweep all before her? And I'm allowed to use future knowledge. So, that is something, believe it or not, I've pondered greatly. Not necessarily for the Brazilian Navy, but how would you turn Great Eastern into a viable warship? She just has a fantastic amount of displacement. So, assuming that I've got basically an entire Navy's budget to convert it with, 1885, so we're looking at central battery ironclads beginning to die out, turret ironclads just about beginning to come in. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scrap the propellers, the paddle wheels. Scrap the paddle wheels, scrap their casings, scrap the engines. That'll save me a ton of weight to start with. Replace the machinery with more modern machinery for the screw propeller. Probably leave the sails in place because that's worth doing. Except for probably fore and aft sails. Now, it is a little bit of an annoying one with 1885 because technically you could go with a central battery ironclad and maybe just about get away with it, which would make things a lot easier with the whole sail issue. But the ship is so large that potentially you could go for a kind of half and half. So where the paddle boxes had been, install a form of central battery gun emplacement, probably with some quicker firing guns, and then remove the fore and aft masts and replace them with turrets, probably carrying twin 12-inch guns. So you'd have this kind of odd hybrid where the sails would get you around just, the more modern machinery and the vast amount of hull space would allow you to basically motor around pretty much anywhere, with the exception, obviously, if the engine breaks down. And then you've got this central armoured battery of rapid-firing guns. It's somewhat tempting to try and put the gun turrets a lot closer to amidships, but that would require me to ditch the sails entirely. You could do that, I suppose. It is 1885, the engine technology is probably there. You've certainly, as I say, got the fuel. I'm just a little bit hesitant with that single screw propeller. I definitely don't want the paddle wheels. But I suppose if you want to throw caution to the wind and assume that your single screw is always going to function, then you probably could mount, well, to be honest, on the ship the size of the Great Eastern, you could probably put 4 turrets, sort of Russian Gangut style, all along the length of it and arm it with pretty much whatever you wanted. at which point you've kind of invented the dreadnought, albeit hilariously inefficiently, because the thing is, you've got to remember, whatever you do, you're also going to have to save some weight for armour. Now, you're going to get a bit of weight back by stripping out the fancy fixtures and fittings, dropping some of the masts and getting rid of the entirety of the paddle wheel assembly, plus the new engine that you're putting in, but you're still going to have to put some armour plate on it. And that's probably going to be the single greatest risk for this modified Great Eastern. It's such a large target, you cannot possibly cover all of it in armour. You can cover the machinery spaces and the main battery, but there's going to be an awful lot at either end that's going to be exposed. So you probably want to invest in an Italian cellular style system. So Christian Slot Hulk asks, in the second half of 1942, if the US Navy sends a carrier to the home fleet for use in raids against Tirpitz, and the Royal Navy sends a carrier to take part in the Guadalcanal campaign, how does the Royal Navy carrier change the night actions there? Now, that is quite the interesting one, because obviously the Royal Navy carriers have night-capable swordfish with radar-equipped, ASB radar-equipped, plus obviously torpedoes. The main question at that point is going to be, obviously the carrier is going to be operating under Halsey. Now, with Halsey in charge, he is probably aggressive enough once he is informed of their capabilities to push that carrier forward in order to try and take advantage of those capabilities. The question is exactly when. I mean, if they're there right from the start, I mean, at the beginning, Fletcher pulls all of his carriers back. So first Savo Island's not really going to have any effect. But once you get into the night battles of Guadalcanal, given that the Cactus Air Force was flying air raids pretty much up until the point the sun went down, if anything, to be honest, if the US admirals and generals are thinking on their feet, and they probably will be, I'd actually be semi-tempted to deploy whichever armoured carrier it is, deploy their swordfish to Henderson Field, and then re-equip the carrier itself with Wildcats and Avengers, because then you can have your carrier sit back away with the rest of the US carriers, but you don't have to get it a little bit too dangerously close at night and risk Japanese surface forces, but you retain that night strike capability. And then when you get probably the biggest change will be the naval battles of Guadalcanal, the first and second nights, then you have the possibility of marauding torpedo bombers operating in the dead of night, which, I mean, there's the second night action, the one with Washington and South Dakota. They're not going to save South Dakota from the pasting that she takes, and Washington does Kirishima in quite nicely. But the first night action, the one where Callahan and Scott are killed, if you've got random flights of swordfish coming in based on radar contacts and dropping torpedoes on Hiei and Kirishima and breaking up the Japanese formation, that might make a lot of the difference. And apart from anything else, even if they don't launch strikes, if you just have the ASV radar swordfish there, they can tell Callahan and Scott what's ahead of them, rather than having to wait for the SG radar to pick it up. You can have radar picket aircraft flying forwards and saying, oh yeah, well look, there's a Japanese fleet here, you need to get ready for it. So yeah, that's it would change things a fair bit, I think, at that point. Kesey asks, to Admiral King's shock and horror, after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt decides to appoint you as commander of the Pacific Fleet. History flows in the same order, with the divergence being that your intel on Midway is not as good. The Japanese somehow managed to take the island by surprise. 2 days after Midway is occupied, the ball is in your court, and King demands action. Okay, so the Battle of Midway hasn't been fought, I presume, at this point, or at least it hasn't been fought by the US carriers. This kind of works in my favour, because the Kido Butai will have had to withdraw to refuel, etc. So the Japanese fleet is going to be away. they will have taken absolutely murderous losses, assuming that they've somehow taken Midway at all, which is going to be... that's going to work in my favour. So 2 days after Midway, I'm probably just going to marshal all the carriers I can get my hands on, wait a week or so until the Japanese have withdrawn, and then that'll give me time to marshal a counter-invasion force, and then sail back and retake Midway. Launch a bunch of, obviously, Avengers and Dauntlesses to bomb the place. First, bomb the Japanese formations, what's left of them, and hopefully by the time the Japanese turn around and realise what's going on and come back, Midway will be well invested by myself. Because, yeah, okay, it's going to be just as difficult on paper for me to retake Midway as it's going to be for them to have taken it in the first place, except the Japanese, if they've somehow managed to take it in the first place, have done me the favour of presumably taking out most, if not all, of the defences. And, you know, the US owned Midway already, so the US already knows where the weak spots, if any, would be, and it has a slightly better developed doctrine for amphibious assault at this point. General Dipper asks, alternate history. So it's May 1937. Okay, so May 1937, Spanish Civil War. 2 Soviet supplied bombers hit the Deutschland, the German Panzerschiff, and caused multiple casualties. According to Anthony Beaver, Hitler had to be argued down from openly declaring war on Republican Spain. Alternately, if the bombs cause more damage, the fires get out of control, and a limited magazine explosion puts Deutschland out of action for at least 6 months, needing expensive repairs in a home port. Hitler declares war on both Spain and threatens all Soviet shipping while publicly ruling out a conflict on land. What are the key naval engagements in 37-38 in the Baltic, Mediterranean and Atlantic, and how do they go? The Royal Navy and the French sit this out, providing none of their ships are attacked. Well, there's not really going to be all that much going on in the Baltic, because in 1937, whilst, you know, the Soviets have the Ganguts, or what's left of the Gangut class, and they're not exactly the world's greatest ships, the Kriegsmarine doesn't really have anything much bigger than a Deutschland class. So the Kriegsmarine, outside of a few submarine operations, is not really going to be going into the Baltic because of the risk of running into a Gangut or two. Around Spain, however, that's another matter. You've got the 2 remaining Deutschlands, which theoretically you can deploy. And Spain doesn't have all that much of a navy, and what it does have is split, so there's potentially a single España-class dreadnought floating around as opposition, and a few cruisers. So I suspect that most of the naval engagements will be the case of German cruiser formations led by the Deutschlands joining up with Franco's Spain, and then or Spanish naval forces, and then they're just going to go and try and hunt down the Republican Spanish naval forces, at which point they'll probably win that by sheer weight of numbers apart from anything else, and then that's pretty much going to be it. As I say, Spain's navy is not massive and is already split, so the Spanish navy, well, the Republican side of things, will get knocked out, and that's that. Really, for the Ganguts to be considered viable targets by the Kriegsmarine or by anything other than U-boats, you need to wait until the Scharnhorst get into service. John Lubbers asks, at the Battle of the Falklands, are there any scenarios in which von Spee could either have won or caused the British enough damage to allow some or all of his ships to escape? For example, charging to take the British under fire whilst they're still coaling. And what if instead of having his ships separated, he'd had them all together, realised whatever was in harbour likely couldn't be outrun, and attacked anyway? Would this have ended better or worse than having his ships arranged as they were historically, being fired upon by Canopus? Or if he bypassed it altogether, what were the odds of the British ever finding them? So, yeah, this is something we've visited a few times. When it comes to what von Spee could have done, if he'd bypassed the Falklands, he would have gotten further home. That is certain. But the problem he's going to face is that the further north he gets into the Atlantic, the more British ships there are and the less ocean there is for him to hide in. Ultimately, to get in back to Germany, he's going to have to either go via the Channel or via the North Sea. If he goes via the Channel, then there's multiple squadrons of pre-dreadnought battleships waiting for him, and it's obviously a very narrow and confined space, so that's pretty much suicide. If he goes via the North Sea, then he has a slightly better chance in as much as there is a little bit more open water for him to run in. However, if he is spotted by any of the blockading ships and they radio that back, the battle cruiser fleet is, or at the time the battle cruiser squadrons, are present in reasonable numbers and can and will run him down. The two Invincibles were bad enough, let alone being chased by a couple of 13.5-inch armed ships, which are both faster, more heavily armed, and more heavily protected. So, realistically, weird as it sounds, about the best chance that von Spee actually has is probably to follow Goeben's example, make a night transit through the Straits of Gibraltar, hope he isn't spotted, and then run like heck across the Mediterranean and hope that the various armoured cruisers and such like that are present in the area don't come chasing after him, which, that's going to be quite the interesting chase, shall we say. As far as going after Sturdy's squadron in the Falklands, the main problem he has is that Canopus is firing on him using spotters, so he can't see Canopus to return fire, and those 12-inch shells will hurt if they hit. And technically there's nothing to stop the spotters Canopus has put up radioing or telephoning or signalling in some way what they're seeing to the two battle cruisers and the other ships that are present in the harbour. Yes, they are more vulnerable to von Spee, but von Spee is still vulnerable to their guns, and he's still going to have to get relatively close in order to hurt especially the battle cruisers. There's not really a lot he can do at that point, unfortunately. He pretty much has to cut and run. The best thing for him to do is to bypass it entirely, but if he does approach the Falklands and he does see what's going on, then really he needs to do the cut and run and scatter almost immediately, rather than try and stick all in formation and see if he can outrun the battle cruisers, which turns out he can't, because that will at least give his ships a little bit more of a chance of survival. Grey Ghost asking, didn't he have torpedoes? Yes, he did have torpedoes, but in order to use them, because, the British ships are anchored inside a sheltered harbour, he would have to enter the harbour. And if he did that, he's going to be sailing through the relatively narrow, clear channel for harbour entrance, at which point he's essentially sailing in a very predictable line into point-blank gunfire from numerous 12-inch guns, which he's not really going to last very long against. E.A. Shima asks, the US Alaska class seemed to be largely wasted in service with the USN by commissioning too late to see any use in their intended role and are mostly delegated to carrier escort. Which other nation in the war would benefit the most if Alaska and Guam suddenly appeared in their biggest harbour in January 1940, assuming both ships just need crews and everything else is fully stocked? Well, it's not going to help the Japanese too much. I mean, I guess they could add them to their repertoire with the Congos, which would make them somewhat more lethal early on. The Russians really are boxed in, so that's not particularly useful for them. The Royal Navy, well, the French, obviously, they're out of the war pretty quickly, so that's not going to help. So that leaves you with Britain, Germany, and Italy. For Germany, in January 1940, that basically doubles their battleship caliber equipped fast ships. So because they've got the Scharnhorst and now they've got Alaska and Guam. So that would potentially allow something like Operation Berlin to be far, far more lethal. So that'd be quite useful for Germany. For the Italians, you've now got, again, 2 fast ships armed with very powerfully hitting 12-inch guns. So that gives them effectively 6 capital ships, albeit the Alaska and Guam are not that well armoured, before they even get the Littorios, which means with their entry into the war, that's going to make the Mediterranean situation a lot worse. And then you've got the British, and for the British, I mean, if they would probably count them as battle cruisers, so they'd augment Renowned, Repulse and Hood with them, which would be very useful for things like hunting down German commerce raiders and hunting Scharnhorst, the 2 Scharnhorst, when they go out on Operation Berlin. So any of those 3 navies would find them quite useful. Obviously, Alaska and Guam, they've got late 45 anti-aircraft batteries and radar and such like, so that all of that technology would be a huge jumpstart to various efforts. Although, with that said, given that the Italians have suspended their radar program, that probably means the intrinsic value of those elements is probably lesser for them. So of the various navies that would benefit, probably be either the British or the German navies, effectively looking at commerce raiding in the North Atlantic, either as a counter to it or to augment it. Then you've got Andreas Hildebrand. Would you ever consider doing a Wednesday special on the loss of HMS Victoria? Yes, I would. There's a lot of material covering Admiral Tryon and the whole manoeuvre on why it happened and what happened and the aftermath of it. So yes, that is on the list of things to do at some point in the future. That one specifically asked me to do it on September the 1st, so I won't answer that now. Andrew Simmons, as you're currently looking into the naval wargaming systems used by navies, yes I am, how about looking into current gaming systems? He says, I've currently played a few. I'm captivated by War on the Sea. Victory in the Pacific is good, but War on the Sea has great individual battles. Have you seen these games and what are your thoughts? To be honest, I haven't seen all that many naval war games in terms of computer-based ones. So there's the obvious ones, War Thunder and World of Warships, then Atlantic Fleet and Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. They're the naval-based games that I own, as far as I'm aware. The thing is that a lot of the naval war games, I used to play Navy Field back when that was a thing, but a lot of naval war games are relatively speaking recent innovations in the last sort of 5-10 years or so. There were a few before then, but most of the stuff that I've seen is more recent, and in that time I haven't had as much time to explore and play new games as I have had in the past, because, well, for a good chunk of the last 4 or 5 years I've been sort of doing a day job and this and, you know, my other outdoor hobbies. Now, without the day job, I've got a little bit more time on my hands, but that's a relatively recent development in comparison to the last few years. I'm just going through my Steam library quickly and can't see anything else other than well, there's naval art. What's that's worth? I never did quite get the hang of that, to be honest. And then you've got things like some of the Total War stuff and War Game Airland Battle, Red Dragon, etc. that have some elements of naval combat in them. Ooh. Okay. CL Captain, if Germany were to be given its allocation from the Anglo-German Naval Treaty in the London Naval Treaty, so that's 35% of the Royal Navy, what ships would they have kept and what ships would they have built? Independent of what Germany would have done, would their inclusion have changed negotiations and other aspects of the treaty? Well, the London Naval Treaty basically kicks them off in construction maybe 4 or 5 years earlier. So in terms of ships they would have kept, well, they haven't got much because they've just got the Versailles Treaty ships plus the Deutschlands and Emden at that point. They're getting on to building some light cruisers. What it will mean is if Germany is granted 35% of the Royal Navy's tonnage, so that would make them... that would give them, in theory, about 5 capital ships worth. So I'm just trying to work that out. So 5 capital ships worth. Yeah, the French are not going to be happy about that. The French are going to demand that their treaty allocation in the London Naval Treaty, their displacement is increased, and the Italians are going to argue for the same thing. Yeah, that's going to cause some major issues. In terms of what they're going to build, you'll probably see something similar to the Scharnhorsts. Maybe just an earlier version of them, simply because Germany needs to get back in the battleship design game. So, and that's kind of their intermediate step. But it would mean that by the time the war breaks out, they're probably going to have couple of Scharnhorst equivalents. They will have completed Graf Zeppelin because they would have had the time to do so, and then you're not necessarily going to see them go straight to a Bismarck, an early Bismarck, but some kind of 15-inch armed battleship, if you like, sort of a Bismarck version 0.5, being built at the time when historically the Scharnhorst would have been built, and then probably the Bismarcks, or maybe a slight upgrade to the Bismarcks, built around the time the Bismarcks themselves were. Yeah, so... Oh, and they might have actually got some decent light cruisers at some point, because they've got a bit more time to build up their navies. Coos Army 0001. If the French army revolts of 17 and 18 become a full-blown rebellion, and due to internal strife and collapse of their army the French are forced to bow out of the war, with the Western Front now shut down, what do England and Germany do next? It depends if America is involved at the point that the French start to collapse. Because if it's before America declares war, well then if France is out of the game and Germany's in the middle of pushing Russia out of the game, the British have no particular interest in single-handedly fighting the German army on land in Europe, never mind the fact they don't actually have anywhere to fight anymore because, you know, France has said we're out and they're on French soil. So there would probably be some kind of negotiated peace. What that would look like, I have no idea. Whereas if the Americans are just about getting involved in the war and they've actually declared war, it's a lot more difficult because without French soil to actually base in, and with France itself now ostensibly neutral, there's not a tremendous amount of places that they can go to get rid of the German army. But on the other hand, if France is out and neutral and Russia is out and neutral, then there's not really many places for the German army to go either. So if the war continues, you'll probably see a massive confrontation in the Alps, which is just going to be absolutely horrific. Yeah, because, you know, all the wonders of trench warfare, except now with high altitude sickness and snow and freezing temperatures. At which point the focus of the war is probably actually going to switch to a much more naval style of things. So that probably overall benefits the British because they've got a smaller front line to work with and it's moving more to a naval war. The thing is that unless Germany forces some incredibly lopsided peace treaties on France and Russia, even more so than they did on Russia historically, they're eventually going to run out of resources just through the Royal Navy blockade. But, you know, they could force something like, well, we're going to trade with France over land borders and France can import stuff, which then leaves the British in the rather unenviable position of deciding, do we blockade France as well, which they might do if the US is involved, or they might just call the whole thing over to a negotiated peace. To be honest, probably 80% of those scenarios involve some form of negotiated peace. Cody 85 pointing out part of the Western Front is in Belgium. But kind of, but by 1917, do you really want to try and fight the entire German army in just Belgium? James Barker says, I know you're not a big fan of conspiracy theories, but what do you think happened to Flight 19 on I forget which way around it is, but Flight 19, the flight of Avengers that disappeared into the Bermuda Triangle, so to speak? Honestly, I have no idea. Probably some form of navigation error, given that there were some radio fixes on their positions shortly before they vanished. But it's not something I've looked into in a tremendous amount of detail, and so it's not something I'd be particularly qualified to speak on, other than, aircraft randomly going missing through navigation errors was a thing that was happening at the time. Weather conditions around there are a little bit weird, and ultimately I don't think we're going to know unless and until somebody finds some remnants of them, at which point it'll be a whole load of extra conspiracies as to how they got to wherever it is they got. But yeah, it's not the kind of thing that I've looked into too much, other than to go, and it's probably not aliens. Apart from anything, there's far more advanced US Navy aircraft than the Avenger in 1945 for them to kidnap. Stephen Fisher Stavinsky asks, looking ahead to the space forces and navies of the near future, there seems to be a disconnect between science fiction on the one hand, which borrows almost all of its terminology from the naval sphere, and the reality on the other hand, where space operations have become the preserve of air forces, or in the case of China, related to information warfare. So the question is, at what point do navies and naval terminology start affecting real space operations? And by that point, will it be already too late and fighting spacecraft will be forever commanded by generals? I think it's going to depend on what kind of size of spacecraft there are. Because I think one of the fundamental issues... Sorry, ice cream van showing up, as you can probably hear in the background. I think one of the fundamental issues that's going to be that you're looking at when it comes to this is stuff like, the Apollo modules and most of the current proposed manned units are pretty small, so they kind of fall into that category of piloted vehicle rather than commanded vehicle. The biggest kind of regular visitor to space in terms of something that's manned was the space shuttle, and even the space shuttle is about the size of a large aircraft rather than like a destroyer or something. So at that point, you're going to be looking at... That's going to be air. It lends itself to being Air Force, apart from the fact it's up in the sky. Once you end up with ships that have crews in perhaps the dozens and are considerably larger than the spacecraft we have these days, that, I think, is where more naval-based elements are going to come in, probably taken from submarine operations and such like. But when our spacefaring technology is going to be to a level where that it's capable of supporting that kind of shipping is, a bit up in the air. So... Oh yeah, sorry, Steve Fisher says it's apparently Stawinsky. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I think it's going to. I'd say probably if by 2040, somewhere in the 2040s, if we have a large enough spacecraft to merit the term of ship rather than craft, then you'll probably see a gradual switch over to naval terminology. If we get much past the 2050s, 2060s, and we're still just got spacecraft with very small crews, then it'll probably stay more Air Force style. until whatever time we get like a full-on going space navy. Earl Collins asks, if the Royal Navy has decided to name a warship after you, you can choose any ship in any iteration of what would be considered the Royal Navy. The renaming in no way alters the ship's career, plot, armour, or fate, and it will not become a legacy name. There will always be one and only one HMS Drachinifel. So which one and why? That's a good question. I'd probably go for something in the 1880s. So one of the slightly odd ironclads of that kind of time period, just before everything settles down on pre-dreadnought levels. Because, yeah, I mean, HMS Drachinifel is a little bit of an odd name compared to a lot of the other Royal Navy stuff, so it would fit in that era when the Royal Navy was going for some rather weird and wonderful names, and it would probably be a completely eccentric and mad kind of prototype vessel that goes nowhere but has very interesting engineering features, which would appeal to me greatly. Whereas, you know, the problem is if you go into sort of World War One or World War Two, you're either going to end up sticking the name on a ship that still doesn't do all that much anyway, or get sunk, or you're going to be muscling in on the territory of a ship that actually is well known and has a really cool name anyway, like Warspite. So, yeah, I'd say something built in the 1880s that's wonderful and Victorian and eccentric. Richard Goss asks, looking at the hypothetical 28-knot Queen Elizabeth, this is assuming that Jellicoe gets this way with small tube boilers, say Valiant and Warspite in this guise replace Prince of Wales and Hood. How does this play out, assuming Bismarck doesn't just decide to run when she identifies Warspite? Okay, so they're going to be the, modernised, two of the modernised QEs, and they're motoring along at 28 knots. At that point, you've got very good gunnery on both ships. You'll have pretty much the latest and greatest tech on both ships. So, I mean, Prince of Wales's gunnery was not too bad. So you can look at Prince of Wales as a kind of a minimum threshold, and then obviously Warspite's performance in the Mediterranean as a top-end threshold. So that means overall, although the number of guns is slightly reduced, the overall level of gunnery is going to be significantly increased, because Hood was kind of hampered by the fact she still had a late 1910s, early 1920s fire control system. So you've got two good shooting ships firing shells that can hurt Bismarck. On the other hand, their armour scheme has not been updated and is weaker than, it's equivalent to Hood's, albeit coverage is somewhat different, and it's weaker than Prince of Wales. So they're going to be a bit more vulnerable to Bismarck's fire overall, but they're also going to be shooting first, and they're going to be shooting accurately. So that's a very interesting one, actually, because if once Bismarck finds the range, it can do some serious damage to either Valiant or Warspite. But if Valiant and Warspite concentrate on Bismarck, they're probably going to start scoring hits before Bismarck does, the same as Prince of Wales did, and obviously because there's two of them firing, there's going to be scoring more hits. So it's possible that Bismarck might end up having, its fire control systems or some other part of it badly damaged before it starts to bracket in. And given that, what killed Hood is always going to be a really, 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 really lucky shot, the odds of this playing out again are unlikely. So I would say probably, if you're talking about a full-on 28-knot Queen Elizabeth pair, probably one or the other will get somewhere between medium and heavy damage fighting Bismarck before Bismarck, at least in terms of her fire control accuracy, succumbs to a hail of 15-inch gunfire. And during that delay, Norfolk and Suffolk are going to show up and, take on Prince Eugen. So overall, the Battle of the Denmark Strait probably is going to end in favour of the British, because once Prince Eugen goes down, even if whichever one of Valiant and Warspite's been badly damaged has to fall back, those two heavy cruisers, or at least one of, are going to be engaging Bismarck's unengaged side and smashing things up there as well. So it's going to be very interesting and fairly close, but I think overall the two QEs would probably win it at their 28 knot iteration, purely because of the amount of accurate fire they can deliver rather than anything else. October Nid asks, Axis versus Allies, a carrier battle in a winner-takes-all fight to the finish. The Gulf of Mexico plays host to a showdown where every carrier that both sides finished before the war ended, plus Graf Zeppelin and Aquila, but with no aircraft. Who wins and who are the most valuable players? Well, the sheer number of carriers that the Allies are going to be bringing to the table at that point means they're going to win the actual fight hands down. If you've got the Lexingtons there, they're obviously carrying 8-inch guns, so that's going to be quite fun for their firepower. But if you've got the Illustriouses, the Implacables, Courageous, Glorious, Furious, and Ark Royal, there's a lot of 4.5-inch guns there. The Yorktowns and the Essexes are just going to smother everything in 5-inch gunfire, and there just physically aren't that many. Not even looking at escort carriers, but just on looking at fleet carriers, there just aren't that many on the other side. You're basically talking about the Japanese carrier fleet plus Graf Zeppelin and Aquila. Now, Graf Zeppelin probably has the single greatest level of firepower present, and Shinano, being kind of a downgraded Yamato, is going to be very difficult to sync with the guns they have available. So Graf Zeppelin's probably going to be kind of the underdog player who hits quite hard and quite fast, but there's just so many more carriers on the Allied side that they're just going to... You could engage 2 or 3 to 1 and smother everything that comes at you in 5-inch and 4.5-inch fire. Someone pointing out, yes, you could take Furious with a tail 18-inch gun, because she's technically a carrier if you go back far enough to 1918. That would be quite funny. Mr. V asks, if you change places of USS Portland and HMS Exeter, so you have USS Exeter and HMS Portland, how would Portland fare? Would she do better against Graf Spee, or perhaps survive long enough against the Japanese? And would Exeter have as much success in Portland's spot, or would she be one of many ships at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound? Thank you very much, Christopher Conrad and Big Al. So, Portland in place of Exeter, she has more 8-inch guns. So, yeah, she's going to do better against Graf Spee. I mean, neither Portland nor Exeter have the armour to stand up to 11-inch gunfire, but Portland can throw a lot more 8-inch shells downrange instead. Would she survive longer against the Japanese? Possibly, depends on the quality of her gunnery. Exeter had the misfortune of, whilst having been modernised in between the Battle of the River Plate and her final battles under ABDA command, she also had a fresh crew, which was the reason her gunnery quality went down, even though she had much better quality systems on board. So, yeah, Portland generally is going to do better, if for no other reason than she just has more firepower. Would Exeter have as much success in Portland's spot or go down? I think if we're talking about Exeter in her state, well, as she would have been had she not been sunken in the early part of 1942, she probably would have done slightly better than Portland during the Guadalcanal campaign, purely because, as I said, shortly before deploying to the Pacific, she was fully modernised with all the latest and greatest radar. So between that and obviously a British crew have been trained how to use it. I mean, okay, it's USS Exeter at this point, but assuming that her crew are coming across, they know how to use radar. They're probably therefore going to have a bit more success operating between that and their night fighting training in actually taking the fight to the enemy. Of course, if Exeter gets hit, she is, going to do just as bad, if not worse, than Portland, because she's a bit smaller, so she can't take quite the same level of damage, but she might be able to inflict a lot more damage sooner anyway. Plus, of course, she has torpedoes, so she might be able to get some cheeky torpedoes out using radar. Grey Ghost, Iron Brew is, well, what you would call a soda. Andrew Boyle. Okay, this is a fairly long one. Okay, so it's about... Oh, yes, this is the one about Fiji. So, effectively, it boils down to... Could you do a 5-minute guide on HMS Fiji? Yes, HMS Fiji is on the list of things to do, so I will very definitely be doing a 5-minute guide to HMS Fiji at some point. Especially since, technically speaking, it was also the leadership of a subclass of the Town class. And as he points out, yes, Fijian soldiers were pretty darn scary in jungle warfare during World War II, and they remain highly valued elements in the British Army when they choose to serve in the British Army, which they have the option to do. Chris Gregory asks, if Nelson survives Trafalgar, let's say the musket ball grazes his back rather than punches through his shoulder, how does his career progress from that day, and can his brilliance overcome his scandalous personal life? For a while, yes, but long-term, probably no. I mean, it depends what postings he's given as well. So he's going to come off of Trafalgar as, the conquering hero, so he will have all the plaudits that come from that. Perhaps not quite as many, because there is always the element of, the tragic hero dying at the cusp of his greatest victory, which amplifies what the memorial to Nelson that you get with things like Trafalgar Square and such. But he is still going to get quite a lot of plaudits for winning Trafalgar. The thing is, once he's won Trafalgar, there isn't really any more for major naval engagements of the Napoleonic Wars. So what do you do with him? Do you put him back on, after a little bit of R&R, do you put him back on blockade duty, which is probably the best thing for the Royal Navy, because while he's out on blockade duty, he can't be engaged in further scandals ashore? Or do you sort of park him ashore as kind of, well, he's now won all these battles, let's keep him in reserve as our kind of sort of our break glass in case of emergency admiral? If he's allowed back ashore, then I think it depends what happens at that point, because his personal life is fairly scandalous at that point, and that would dent his reputation, but it's probably just going to continue along those lines. He'll probably end up marrying Emma Hamilton at some point, or at least try to, but eventually people will get used to it, and it's just going to depend on how he plays that. Ultimately, he will probably see out the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and then he'll be a peacetime admiral, which is probably not going to sit too well with him, because he is very much a sort of a person of action. He was looking forward to sort of spending some more time ashore, though, so you could potentially see like with the Hoods, for example, and a few others, Samaritzes and such, you could see him starting a naval dynasty, but I struggle to see where he would fit in a peacetime Royal Navy. So probably the best thing for him is he spends most of the rest of the Napoleonic Wars on blockade duty. Who knows, they might even, for a bit of action, they might even send him off to bother the Americans in the War of 1812. Sorry, America. Which might give him a one last chance at seeing action if he's prepared to step down from, commanding first rates and such, which will still be wanted on blockade duty. And then, he just lives out his life as best he can, and he'll probably go down then as one of Britain's most successful admirals, certainly very highly ranked, but he won't get quite the same level of following that he does today because, you know, he doesn't die at the height of his power, if you like. Joseph Nielsen asks, I understand that Japan and Germany did not rotate their best pilots back to train new recruits, leading to very inexperienced pilot corps in the latter years of World War II. Why was this? Cultural reasons, military reasons. You kind of have this... I think it's perhaps a little bit too narrow a focus on individual skill. So it's going to be a difficult one at that point, because for the British and the Americans, the ones who sort of practice this rotation thing, you get a really good pilot, you rotate them back, and you can see the benefits of it, because if that really good pilot can pass on his skills and his operational experience to everybody else, then you have a bunch of not better than him, but better than average pilots hopefully going out, which means the overall effectiveness of your Air Force increases. But each individual pilot might only shoot down 3 or 4 aircraft on average, because they're okay pilots who've just been given a bit of a boost. Whereas if you have your elite pilots on the front line racking up kill after kill after kill, you get these really big scores like Eric Hartmann did, but no 1 or 2 good pilots can turn the tide of a war. But if you're looking just on individual kill counts, you might go, oh yeah, well, this guy's killed 50 aircraft and this guy's killed 100 aircraft, so if we keep this guy who's killed 50 in the field, he'll kill 100, and that's a lot. But, you know, you're kind of almost missing the wood for the trees, because if that guy who can kill 50 or 100 aircraft can teach everybody else to kill, say, 3 or 4 aircraft instead of 1 or 2, well, if he trains 300 pilots and they all kill 2 additional aircraft, then that actually overall has cost the enemy 800 aircraft. So it's just, how do you see yourself using your pilots? I think this is the other thing, if you're envisaging a short war, you probably want your best pilots to stay on the front line as long as possible, because they'll probably survive a year or 2 of war and do a lot of damage, whereas if they're training new pilots, the newly trained pilots will only be coming online as the war ends. Whereas if you're expecting the war to last a fairly long time, you definitely want your better pilots to rotate back. E.M. Hurst asks, Japanese intelligence has learned of the Doolittle raid, and as a result, Enterprise and Hornet are sunk in a counterattack. How does the US Navy defend against Japanese offensives until the Essexes are available? With great difficulty, because Coral Sea will leave them without any operational fleet carriers until they pull Wasp in, because Yorktown will be damaged, Lexington's down, Saratoga is damaged, and with Enterprise and Hornet out of the picture, you've only got Ranger and Wasp, and even in those circumstances, as we saw when they only had Saratoga around, they're probably still not going to want to pull in Ranger. So you're basically talking about Wasp and a patched up Hornet trying to hold the line. That's not enough for something like Midway, at which point they're probably going to be screaming. They're probably either going to have to take a real risk and maybe call Ranger back in, or they're going to be screaming at the Royal Navy, as they did a little bit after Midway, to lend them 1 or more Royal Navy carriers, which the Royal Navy is not in a position to really do that in early 42. So they'll probably have to try and defend Midway, but Midway will be a much more closely fought battle, because okay, fair enough, Hornet's air group kind of ruled itself out of the game, but if we assume, for sake of argument, that Yorktown and Wasp's air groups pull off a similar thing to what Enterprise and Yorktown's air groups did historically, but then when the Japanese counterstrike comes back, assuming they take Hornet out again, you're now down to Wasp and eventually Saratoga. You can't really sustain the Guadalcanal operations with 2 carriers. I don't think they'd be prepared to take that risk, especially if they're given that the losses of carriers would have been so much greater and so much quicker. So Guadalcanal probably gets postponed unless and until they can get the Royal Navy to lend them a carrier or two, at which point they might very well then, enact Guadalcanal a little bit further down the line with a mixture of British and American carriers present. But I think the US generally would be a little bit more reticent about offensive operations until the Essexes come back, because at that point, assuming that Wasp and Saratoga aren't destroyed or damaged in defensive operations, even once the first couple of Essexes come back, they've still only got 4 carriers, and the Japanese will have more, assuming that the Guadalcanal campaign hasn't gone on. So it would take a fair bit of time to get kind of carrier superiority unless they can force some kind of battle against the Japanese in late 42 that is somehow to their advantage, with maybe, let's say, maybe a two American and 2 British, or 2 American and 1 British carrier on loan. Stephen Ruzika asks, do you think that while the Regia Marina was refitting the Cavours and Duilios, they could have upgunned them to 15-inch? Not really. The rule of thumb, as I've said before, generally is that if you drop a gun, you can go up by about 2 inches. If you look at that from the Italian perspective, that means you could go up to 14-inch guns, but the Cavours and Duilios have a mixture of triple and twins. No one in their right mind in the interwar period is going to be equipping with a single gun turret. Twins, okay, but even assuming you build some kind of somewhat cramped twin 15-inch turret and somehow manage to leverage that in, you can't use the twin 12s, so you're going to have to, at that point, you're going to have to somehow try and retain the midships triple. So you're going to end up with something that's kind of like a Renown but worse, i.e. 6 15-inch guns in a very weird arrangement. That's not really going to work. I can't see them pulling that off in any meaningful way without effectively just stripping the entire thing down to the keel and rebuilding effectively brand new ships, at which point you might as well just build more Littorios. Thank you very much, Ray W. Tyler Kennedy, that's a Paravanes question, I'll come back to that. Chris Bruce, if a Tillman 4.2 was built and then modernised like the standards, how would it fare compared to the Yamato, and who would win in a fight between the two if it ever happened? If it's modernised in a way similar to the standards, then technically it's Yamato's fight to lose, because the Tillman 4.2 would be hopelessly slower. It's got the firepower to take on the Yamato. It's the armour, maybe not so much. The main thing is if it's going from standard style modernisation, it does not have the speed. So Yamato can either engage it in a circumstance that is favourable to it, or if the circumstances are unfavourable, the Yamato can just leave. Whereas if it's modernised slightly differently, and they put in a brand new power plant and get it up to speed, then it's got a bit better of a chance, because it's harder for Yamato to decline the fight. And by the time, if you're talking about like USS California or USS West Virginia style refits with lots of radar, then there's a number of scenarios at that point where the Tillman 4.2 would have a distinct advantage over Yamato, especially in night actions. But it does need to at least get up to 25, 26 knots. It doesn't necessarily have to match Yamato in speed, but it has to get to within about 3 knots or so before Yamato loses its ability to just go, you know what, I'm out, and wanders off. Duke of Petchington. I noticed in the World War II Mediterranean theatre, Malta was the indirect cause of loss for British convoys on warships. What if Malta's defences, AA batteries, coastal batteries, land forts, etc., etc., were modernised and upgraded or increased before World War II, and how would it have affected the Mediterranean theatre operations for both the Royal and Italian navies? It's not going to change a tremendous amount, to be perfectly honest, because Malta is still vulnerable to airstrikes in terms of its air bases, because, you know, it's close to Italy. And Malta's defences in and of themselves were not really ever the problem. Whereas the problem for Malta was supplies. So if its defences are upgraded, if those defences include things like supply bunkers and much larger infrastructure, then that probably lessens the need for the number of resupply convoys the British have to run. But other than that, you know, food and fuel and that kind of stuff, Malta's still going to need it. And in fact, to be honest, if they've got expanded fighter and bomber bases and expanded defences, they're going to need more of that. So that might actually paradoxically require the Royal Navy to send in even more convoys, which would result in even more losses to prevent the defences being stretched too thin by ammo shortages and the like. So in the early part of the war, it's not going to make a tremendous amount of difference, other than maybe just causing a bit more attrition to Italian and German aircraft. As the war progresses into mid-42 and then into 43, greater amounts of airfield infrastructure and such would allow them to be more effective in ranging out against the Italian convoys going to the desert theatre, etc. But it's too close to be a major naval base for the Royal Navy, because it's still far too vulnerable to a bombing, no matter what kind of defences you put on it that are accurate to the period. And the Italians never seriously tried to take it, so if it's even more defended, they just still wouldn't try and take it. Tom Dudkiewicz, I think. Kiewicz? Yeah, something like Thomas Dudkiewicz, I'm going to call him that anyway. If you've been contacted by a major streaming platform and they're planning on making a Band of Brothers style miniseries but set on a ship, they want you to pick a hero ship for the series and give you the following conditions. It should be a destroyer or cruiser, since carriers and battleships are beyond budget, but corvettes are not glamorous enough. It should be an Allied ship serving in World War II. The ship should have served in at least 2 different theatres, and should have seen enough action to fill around about a dozen episodes. At least one surface battle is a must. The ship must have survived the war, and there's enough written material that goes beyond battle reports to flesh out the characters. What is your pick? Now that's an interesting one, because so no battleships, no carriers, and it's got to survive the war. So you can't do Johnston, you can't do Sydney, or anything like that. And it can't be doing ocean escorts either. So you're probably looking for a ship that either is in service at the beginning of the war or entering service shortly thereafter. And it has to have seen a lot of action. See, this Helena would be a good one, but Helena was lost. And to be perfectly honest, there are a bunch of US heavy cruisers with multiple battle stars, but after the first few episodes where it's all a little bit exciting, once you get to kind of the midpoint of the season, it's just going to be, oh look, we're doing more shore bombardment, oh look, more kamikazes, for like half a dozen episodes. That's not particularly exciting. I would say you're probably looking at either something like maybe USS Wichita, because she served in all sorts of theatres and saw a fair bit of action. Or if you're talking about Royal Navy stuff, probably something like HMS Norfolk. She was there for the Bismarck fight. She was there. She did survive the war. She was also there for the Battle of the North Cape against Scharnhorst. So you've got two major actions there, and she was involved in a lot of other operations. So yeah, if you're talking about cruisers and destroyers, and they've got to survive the war, and they've got to have seen a lot of action, I'd say you're probably looking at either Wichita or Norfolk. Wichita's big centerpiece is probably going to be the Battle of Casablanca. And yeah. Chain gun 1701. How would it affect the speed and design of sailing ships if the atmosphere was twice as dense, or 3 times? How would that affect the design, engines, artillery performance of ships in the Age of Steel? If the atmosphere is 2 or 3 times as dense, you're going to see a lot more low-lying streamlined ships, because all of a sudden wind resistance and air resistance has become a much larger factor. So big superstructures and such not going to be a thing. Sailing ships, well, if the atmosphere is several times as dense, again, high castled ships like you see in the late 1400s, early 1500s are going to be suicidal to have. But at the same time, as well as being lower down, sailing craft will need a smaller sail and fewer masts in order to attain the the forward motion that they need, because there's so much extra force behind them. And equally, masts and sails are going to be massively built, more heavily built, because they've got to withstand a lot more force. So you're probably going to see ships that look a little bit more like galleys and galleasses, just with incredibly heavily built masts and rigging, rather than high-sided fighting ships, because that's going to be a major problem for wind resistance. And even once you get into the age of steam and steel, guns are going to be much shorter range, because there's a lot more air resistance again, and the ships will probably stay more like things like HMS Devastation, i.e. very low in the water, trying to avoid as much wind as possible, as opposed to seat keeping and high freeboards are really good in our environment, but probably pretty terrible in those environments, to be perfectly honest. Right, hang on a second, I'm just going to put this down. Try not to touch any buttons. Iamon saying, what about San Francisco? Well, yeah, San Francisco, it's one of those ships that has a lot of battle stars, but the second half of your entire series is just going to be a series of short bombardments and kamikaze fights. I just need to go, and because I just see someone approaching the door, I'll be back in a second. Right, that's intercepted, so you don't have to withstand the doorbell. Derp Squad pointing out 3 times atmospheric density probably makes guns much less useful, so naval combat is mostly boarding actions. Possibly, but I mean, Age of Sail is quite a lot of boarding actions anyway. And yeah, it would make, as I say, make guns less powerful. It probably mean armor actually stands a much better chance, because armor's not affected by this kind of thing. But once you get proper range finding gear and such, like when you get to the late 19th, early 20th century, the power of guns is such that, okay, maybe you're not going to be engaging at because the engagement ranges at that point are mostly dictated by gun elevation and quality of fire control. So whilst your armor penetration values at 15,000 to 20,000 yards are probably going to be negligible, you can still fight at 8,000 to 10,000 yards quite happily, I would expect. So, gunfights might be a lot closer range, but I think by the 20th century you're still going to be having gunfights at significant range. Because, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 yards is still a fair distance. And that's that dealt with. Right, Todd Webb asks, since it's actually fairly similar in size till you get to destroyers, what happens if you put the entire Kriegsmarine, including stuff that got sunk historically, versus center force? Okay, so this is Bismarck, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, and Gneisenau versus Yamato, Nagato, and 2 Congos. And then you've got, well, if you're including all that, so you've got 3 Hippers and 3 Deutschlands versus the Japanese cruisers. You can take the Königsbergs and the Leipzigs if you want, I suppose. And then you're going to have a destroyer advantage. That's actually a really good hypothetical, because the Germans are going to have the advantage in destroyer numbers for once. Makes a nice change for them. If they do drag their light cruisers out, they'll have a numerical light cruiser advantage, although given that the Japanese cruisers have generally armed with a lot of 8-inch guns and a lot of torpedoes, that's probably going to be a roughly even fight, I would think. Because I would probably give an advantage, because of the long-range torpedo armament and slightly more guns, I'd probably give a general advantage to a Takao over a Hipper. The Deutschlands don't have the speed, but they do hit pretty hard, and the Japanese heavy cruisers are not equipped to deal with that. So that's going to be quite interesting. And then you've got the actual main, sort of the main event. Yamato is going to crush whichever of Bismarck and Tirpitz it goes up against. That's pretty much on the table. Then you've got Nagato versus whichever one Yamato isn't crushing. That's a lot more interesting. At that point, against Nagato, I would probably give whichever one of Bismarck or Tirpitz is going up against them the advantage there. And then you have this very interesting fight of the Scharnhorst versus the Congos. The Scharnhorst are definitely much better protected, even though the Congos are carrying 14-inch guns. And the Scharnhorst 11-inch guns are not pushovers, and the Congos are not particularly well protected at all. So that could go either way, because a single hit from a 14-inch gun, a 14-inch shell, if it gets into somewhere vital, is going to do considerably more damage than an 11-inch shell. But there are more areas on a Congo where an 11-inch shell is going to do damage than, potentially a Japanese 14-inch hitting the main belt of a Scharnhorst. See, the problem is that Yamato crushing Bismarck or Tirpitz, and whichever one of those crushing Nagato, it just means it's another Yamato versus Bismarck fight. So Yamato's probably still going to win that one. It's just so ridiculously heavily armoured and heavily armed compared to a Bismarck. So with a cruiser fight kind of up in the air, I think it's going to come down to, do the German destroyers finish the Japanese destroyers off fast enough to help the cruisers and then the battleships, or does Yamato chew its way through both of the Bismarcks quickly enough to help the Congos against the Scharnhorsts? And how does that battle play out? Because it basically, if the Japanese battleships can finish off the German battleships quickly enough, then they can turn their guns on the cruisers, and then the cruisers and the battleships can turn their guns on the German destroyers, which would just about give the Japanese a victory, although a very costly one. Whereas if the German battleships can hold out against the Japanese long enough for the German destroyers to come in and assist their cruisers against the Japanese cruisers, then you'll kind of get a death by 1,000 cuts on Yamato, and the Congos would be relatively easy to deal with by that at that point through sheer numbers. So it could go either way. It's basically just going to come down to which broad body of ships can deal with the other side first. David B. Prior to World War I, both Germany and the UK built battleships for foreign powers, like the Salamis and Minas Gerais. Okay, so this is complicated. Okay, so similar to Georgios Averov, a wealthy Greek benefactor provides enough money for the Greeks to order 3 30,000-ton, 14-inch armed battle cruisers with German hulls, American guns, 12-inch belt-over magazines, 27 and a bit knot top speed. Turkey responds with a mix of Queen Elizabeth-style guns, Nevada-class all-or-nothing layout, with a heavy belt capable of 27 knots. The British take over the 2 Turkish ships like they would in history. The Germans get to use the Greek ships as everything's delivered before the start of World War I. How does this affect the Battle of Dogger Bank and Jutland? Right, okay, so basically you're taking 2 hypothetical super battle cruisers and putting them, 3 in one hand, 2 in the other, and putting that into place. So the Germans benefit the most because they now have high-speed battle cruisers with heavy armor equivalent to some of the Der Flingers, and heavy guns, which after Jutland is what Scheer wants. And they've got 3 of them, which addresses the numbers balance a little bit better. The British, on the other hand, have these super heavily armoured, for the period, ships with 8 15-inch guns, and they're only a fraction slower, and they had the numerical advantage to start with. For the Battle of Dogger Bank, it's going to depend if they're all there. I mean, if the Germans have one of them not in service for maintenance, that's going to affect them a lot less than if the British have one of 2 out of service. So that's going to make things a lot closer. Jutland... See, the thing is, if you've got a pair of effectively even more heavily armoured 27-knot Queen Elizabeths floating around in the battle cruiser fleet, the argument of integrating them into the 5th Battle Squadron because of similarity of firepower, if not speed, is probably pretty strong. So Jutland might end up significantly worse for Beatty because he will be outnumbered and outgunned if he doesn't keep 5th Battle Squadron with him. Conversely, if he does have 5th Battle, like the existence of these hypothetical super battle cruisers might encourage him to, have the 5th Battle Squadron much closer, perhaps even leading the battle cruiser fleet. At which point, you brought another 4 battleships to the equation, which actually ends worse for the Germans. So it could go either way at Jutland. Dogger Bank, probably more in favour of the Germans, i.e. there would probably be a stand-up fight rather than the Germans running away. So Long John asks, what if Admiral Marschall commanded the German fleet in Norway during the Arctic convoys instead of Ciliax? Probably not a tremendous amount different, to be honest, because the main problem the Germans had during fleet operations against the Arctic convoys was not Ciliax, it was the commanders on the front line, if you like, and the fact that they had virtually no oil or fuel, or no oil fuel or diesel to run their ships on. They had to save up for months before they could deploy the fleet in strengths. Marschall is a fair bit more aggressive and a bit more inventive than most German admirals, but if he's stuck back at base, there's only a limited amount he can do, because he can send Admiral Bay out with Scharnhorst, but we know what happens at North Cape. if Marshall decides, you know what, stuff, I'm taking command of the fleet at sea, then probably something like Barents Sea won't happen, because even if he goes out on that day to fight, he's going to lead the German ships a lot better, and they're probably going to get a lot more success, and he probably will just take absolutely everything he can get his hands on at that point rather than part way. So there'll probably be some more successes for the German fleet, but really the two biggest problems he's going to have is, one, he's going to be expected to stay back in Norway and not lead his fleet, and with the best will in the world, Admiral Bay is not the world's most successful commander. It's not even the Kriegsmarine's most successful or competent commander. And the fuel situation just cripples most of what I would otherwise see Marshall trying. DM Phoenix. In 1969, the British film The Battle of Britain had English composer Ron Goodwin create the fictional Luftwaffe March, which was so well received the song was eventually appropriated by the British military for ceremonial purposes, but retitled Aces High. Do you have any personal favourite fictional marches or compositions which you would like to see utilised for real-world military applications? Well, I'm in agreement with DM Phoenix, actually. Clendathu Drop is an excellent piece of music to use for military purposes if you want. I mean, there's some of the really obvious ones, like the Imperial March. But other than that, see, some of them are really iconic, but I don't necessarily think would work in a military context, because some of them are a little bit too upbeat and jaunty, or perhaps a bit too complex. So you think like the Babylon 5 introduction music, it's a fantastic piece of music. Probably it doesn't quite lend itself to being a full-on military piece, in my opinion, though. Star Trek, most of the Star Trek intro theme tunes, not so much. I could see DS9 or Voyager's intro theme tunes being used to a degree in some elements. Now, the Next Generation theme tune as it stands is a bit too fast. Is a bit too fast paced. But the version of it, the original version it was derived from, that I think was used in Star Trek The Motion Picture, is a little bit slower, and that might make a pretty good fictional march. One fictional march to be repurposed for a military application. Jamie Peter pointing out that Mars by Gustav Holst is a good one. Yeah, and that has been used in sci-fi. There are one or two Stargate background tracks from Atlantis, SG-1 and Universe that might make decent tracks, but the main ones, again, fraction too upbeat, I think. A little bit too fast. Fictional march. I'm sorry, I'm looking at sci-fi stuff, but yeah, fictional marches and compositions generally. I mean, Hans Zimmer's done a ton of stuff that would work pretty well. Everything from some of the tracks in Gladiator through to the obvious Pirates of the Caribbean stuff. But yeah, a lot of Hans Zimmer's stuff is pretty good. Ray W. Bridge Too Far, I suppose, yeah, that's quite good. I mean, the British military is probably just begging to adopt Monty Python's Always Look on the Bright Side of Life for something, probably as a marching song. Yeah, I'd say there's a good few, but those are the ones that immediately come to mind. Tyler Kuhn, alternate history. In an alternate 1934, Hermann Goering dies of a morphine overdose, allowing the Kriegsmarine to operate aircraft and later build aircraft carriers. Knowing they have no experience in building aircraft carriers, they can The Kriegsmarine convinces Hitler to send them to Japan to learn how to build and operate their carriers. What lessons from the Japanese Navy do you think the Germans would learn and later use in their construction of alternate Graf Zeppelin carriers? And how would these two ships affect the Battle of the Atlantic? Well, they did learn a reasonable amount from the Japanese historically. It's just the constraints of German infrastructure meant that Graf Zeppelin couldn't be completed on time. Some crows having an argument now. So, given that they historically did have some lessons from the Japanese, I don't think you're going to see all that much different about the Graf Zeppelins, other than maybe somebody comes across that stupid issue where they ended up with sort of half the German light cruiser fleet's gun armament and maybe corrects that element. As far as how they'd affect the Battle of the Atlantic, as I've covered previously, when it comes to the Graf Zeppelins, they'd probably make half-decent commerce raiders if they were used properly, especially from the fact that at least until they run out of fuel and spare parts, which they could technically restock from other German ships at sea, they don't have to come back into port as often as battleships do. They've got the speed. Even if they halve their gunpowder, they've got the gunpowder, and they can hit targets out at sea without having to risk themselves using their aircraft. But like pretty much all the German raiders, their heyday will be 40-41, because by 42-43, the number of Allied carriers, even if they're escort carriers, is going to increase to a point that makes their operation non-viable. Because, if there's the risk of German carriers wandering around, then the escort carriers would just be fully loaded with fighters. And yeah, okay, maybe the air groups aren't entirely favourably matched up, but eight or a dozen fighters fighting over friendly anti-aircraft cover probably can hold off a German assault, or at least break it up quite heavily. And even if they can't, the amount of losses that they'll inflict on the German air group will probably be sufficient that that's the end of the carrier as a viable raiding unit, unless it goes in all guns blazing. Oh, I know why the crows are arguing. I put some stale bread out in the bird feeder. Rice Cracker asks, what would have changed during World War II if Yamamoto, I think you mean, not Yamato. Yamamoto lost 3 fingers instead of 2 during the Battle of the Tsushima Straits. Well, with him out of service, one of the main driving minds behind the Japanese Navy's expansion and tactics in the 30s is gone. Or retired, doing something else. So that is going to hurt the Japanese war effort. The question is who comes in to replace him, because a lot of the Japanese officers who are sort of slightly below Yamamoto are there in part because Yamamoto wants them there. If he's not there, you're going to probably see a relatively different Japanese command cadre. Some names will still be there, but exactly who and what positions they're going to be in is going to be quite different. Given that Yamamoto was pretty good at standing up to the Japanese army as well, if you don't get someone as good as him in that position, then you might end up with the Japanese Navy becoming somewhat more subordinate to the Japanese army and then focusing more and more on conflict in China and less so looking at the wider Pacific areas. The problem is it's the conflict in China that ultimately brings them into conflict with the United States, so that overall probably ends up putting them in a worse position, because if the Navy has been subordinated slightly more to the army than it was than what the balance of power historically, they're going to be less prepared for a fight in the Pacific, so it actually ends up probably worse for the Japanese. Let's copy out that super chat. Getting there. Not doing too badly. I mean, we've got about an hour left before, as I said, I need to go. So this is probably going to be one of the shortest dry docks on record. Little dry dock lives. Cody asks, what would the naval situation look like if nothing better than sails, oars, and the absolute earliest of steam engines were available as propulsion? Slow. Because, well, you can look at Warrior, for example, and other 1860s ironclads. You're not getting much above the low teens of knots with sails and basic engines. And as armour becomes thicker and thicker and ships become shorter and chubbier, speed's actually probably going to drop off. So you'll get some speed pick up again in the 1890s as things like Harvey and Krupp steel come in and allow you to lighten the ship whilst retaining protection. But if you've never got things like vertical triple expansion engines and turbines and such, then your warships are still going to be limited to sort of 10, 12, 14 knots, that kind of speed. Breaking much above 15 is going to be near enough impossible, so everything's going to be a lot slower. And if it's the absolute earliest of steam engines, so our efficiency doesn't improve, well, I'd say the 1880s and 1890s are going to look very interesting indeed, because all of a sudden you've got rapid-fire, quick-firing guns coming in. Those kinds of things could absolutely demolish masts and sails very quickly, which would technically leave warships in a very vulnerable position, because if you're dismasted and you're now miles away from home with only an engine that's going to run out of fuel very quickly, you are pretty stuffed. Unless you've got a friendly tow home or something like that. Now, obviously, ships could be dismasted in the edge of sail, and they didn't even have a backup steam engine then, and they would have to be towed away. But the ability to tow a dead weight of an armoured ironclad or later vessel, that needs a lot more ambition when it comes to the ship that's doing the towing. But yeah, I think the main thing is naval combat and naval tactics as a whole are going to be a lot slower overall and a lot more dependent on the wind, because you won't be able to just steam anywhere to go into battle. You'll be able to steam against the wind to a degree, but you're still going to be relying on the weather more generally. The Legacy is sending me all the wonderful Super Chat questions. That's great. Right. Primark 359. If the Kriegsmarine had been von Braun's sponsor and funder instead of the army, could they have produced any rocket useful for naval warfare, or were the guidance methods available at the time best suited for city-sized targets? Potentially. I mean, you've got things like the HS 239 in the latter part of the war. The Fritz X, okay, it's a glide bomb, but yeah, actually, no, the Fritz X is not such a brilliant model to follow because it is a glide bomb, but the existence of guided weapons from aircraft kind of does bear out that this kind of thing would be possible. In terms of rocket power, now, rockets useful for naval warfare. In theory, towards the end of the war, it would be possible to derive some kind of very early, very primitive ship-to-ship missile. You'd be talking about something like maybe like a V1. You're definitely not taking a V2 out to sea. I mean, people tried. The US Navy tried after the war. It's a bad idea. But something like a V1, but with the Fritz X or HS-239's radio control assembly, load it up, obviously, with as much explosive as you can and probably some basic armor-piercing head, because it doesn't have to go anywhere near as far. And you could have launch rails on the back of your ship, or instead of the aircraft, launching facilities amidships. And theoretically, there shouldn't be any necessary problem with, sticking the director up in the range-finding positions up on the mast and letting him pilot the thing in. There'd obviously be a little bit more risk because, you know, you're piloting it relatively low to the sea surface, so a sudden dip you might end up crashing it. But I can see some kind of remote piloted V1 as a primitive ship-to-ship missile, certainly. Whether or not that would come in time to actually help the Kriegsmarine is another matter entirely. Probably not. But it could be done, for at least in the time it takes for the Allies to start deploying radio jamming countermeasures, and ultimately the thing, albeit somewhat high speed and somewhat lower profile, is just another low-level air threat, so they could be shot out of the sky by barrage and VT, proximity fused fire, from anti-aircraft guns. But, you know, it would be possible to do. Night Heron Production talking about Regulus. As far as I'm aware, Regulus was effectively just a cruise missile type thing. So we're talking more about a much closer. You're talking about a visual range, within visual range ship-to-ship missile. So if Tirpitz, for example, were probably the only German capital ship still that was alive long enough to could have been fitted with it. If Tirpitz had somehow gotten out with some of these, you'd effectively be looking at a situation where the ship heads into battle, and just as it's approaching what everyone thinks of as maximum gun range, it might volley off half a dozen of these things and try and inflict significant damage on the battleship it's going up against before it engages with guns. Candor asks, many assessments of the Battle of Britain suggest that even if the Luftwaffe had won the war in the air, the Navy would have been able to destroy the invasion fleet or cut it off from supplies. This being the case, imagine that during the fall of France, you're put in charge of a working group put together to stage a deception operation to entice a German invasion so that a large part of the German army could be destroyed or captured. What measures would you take, and how would you rate your chances at success? Assuming perfect cooperation from all services and full operational security. That one is something I've thought about occasionally in the past, and actually assuming those things that you mentioned, i.e. perfect operational security and cooperation from all services, if you're willing to allow German troops to head towards British soil, it wouldn't be that hard to do, because the Germans, especially like now with hindsight, because we know the Germans wanted air superiority, so what you would do is stage a false retreat, so move most of 11 groups fighters most of 11 groups fighters back to 10 group. I think it's that way around. So when the Germans are saying, oh yeah, there's only a half dozen or a few dozen fighters left in the British Isles, when they launch Eagle Day, although London's going to take a bit of a plastering, only respond with a couple of squadrons. They will then assume, okay, we actually have air superiority now, we can try and launch Operation Sea Lion. Now, at that point, actually then launching it is another matter entirely, but if the Germans then take the bait and they do launch it, there's two broad elements to the plan. One is, the whole plan of setting the sea on fire when the Germans come into land, and for that, reference some of the documents I've seen in the National Archives. It's very simple. You do pretty much what they did at the time. You've got the army there, but you've also got the Home Guard, and this is the thing. The Home Guard sometimes get a bit of an unfair rap because people see them as, oh yeah, Dad's army, that kind of thing. And back in my earlier days when I've had the luck to speak to some World War II veterans and even some Home Guard veterans, obviously nowadays most of them not around, the thing you've got to remember is the Home Guard, yes, it did have some old geriatrics who were just there to do their bit, but the vast majority of people who were in the Home Guard were in it because they wanted to fight, but they were too old to enlist practically in the British Army, which means they're mostly survivors of World War I. Now, if you've taken someone who's been through the horrors of trench warfare in World War I, put them back together with a bunch of their old mates, and told them the Germans are coming, and this time they're coming for your family on your home soil, those are not people you want to cross. One of the bits of correspondence I came across in the National Archives, as I think I've mentioned before on the channel, was basically when it comes to this plan of setting fire to the beaches and the sea around it if the Germans tried to invade, the British Army at the time was thinking in terms of, you know, the Germans are coming, we set fire to the beaches and the nearby sea, the Germans see the beaches and the nearby sea are on fire, they don't land because they don't want to go through the burning fuel. So this is a logical deterrent tactic. Some of the Home Guard commanders were going, no, that is far too easy. That's letting them off lightly. What you do is you wait for them to land, then you set the beaches and the seas on fire and burn them all to death. Because, as I say, these people have no interest in seeing the horrors of the trenches revisited on their own families. So there's that element to things. The other element to things would be, from a naval side of things, the Germans are probably going to want to make the crossing at night or in the very early morning hours, because if there's any British aircraft left around, the Germans will know that most of them can attack during the day. Shore defences, it's much easier for them to shoot at the German invasion ships during the day, and most naval vessels, it's obviously the British do have night fighting training, but most naval vessels are better at fighting during the day, and the German relative lack of strength with the Kriegsmarine is somewhat counterbalanced at night time, at least in their thinking, by the fact you can have e-boats and stuff sneaking up close in the cover of night. But this kind of plays into my plan's advantages. So what I would do is similar again to one of the Royal Navy's, one of the various plans the Royal Navy drew up, which is you advance the fleet, the home fleet and everyone else you've called in, as far south as you can without risking coming under major air attack. So you're probably sitting the fleet somewhere northeast off of East Anglia. At that point, then you would go and send in your destroyers, some of your destroyers, corvettes, MTBs, MGBs at night, using radar where possible, maybe some of the light cruisers as well, Didos, if you've got some, Arethuses, etc. And the idea of that is to do kind of hit and run attacks at night, fighting the German escort forces, mostly the E-boats and destroyers, and swiping your way through the landing craft if at all possible. That's going to keep the Germans awake and somewhat distracted and very tired. Yes, you're going to lose ships. Germans are going to lose ships as well, but they're the ship you can probably afford to lose. Whilst this night engagement is going on, you are also advancing your fleet, the cruisers and the destroyers, and their remaining, and the battleships there, and any remaining escorts. So the idea would then be that round about the coming of dawn and the mists beginning to clear, that's when the German invasion fleet, now strung out across the channel and probably half on fire, realizes there's a mass of cruisers and destroyers and battleships bearing down on them. Their own crews are strung out, a lot of their escorts are damaged or destroyed, they're all tired, and then the mass barrage starts. And that's when, obviously, the fact as well that you've deceived them by pulling back the fighters and bombers comes into play, because the other thing you would do is over that the previous evening, when the Germans' attention is focused on the invasion beaches, you move a whole ton of fighters and bombers back close in. So all of a sudden, just as the Germans are thinking, where on earth did the home fleet come from and how do we run away from it, then you see multiple big wings of RAF fighters coming in to basically just overwhelm any German aerial escorts they've got. So that would be my plan. How well it works, you know, it depends to a certain degree on the Germans actually falling for the bait and actually trying Sea Lion in the first place, and weather conditions and such, like unfortunes of war. But I think it's a reasonable plan. John Graubard, now we've almost reached the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. Can you rate the various admirals on both sides? Next week's video. Watch out for watch out for Wednesday's video. Wednesday's upcoming video is going to be the final part of the Guadalcanal campaign. So, yes, your question will be answered there in considerably more detail than I can do here, especially considering I've only got about 45 minutes before I need to skedaddle. But Wayne Borean, instead of a British force at the second and third battles of Narvik, assumed that the Swedes caught wind of the operation and got involved, with a force consisting of a Sverige-class ship, the Gotland and Flygia small cruisers, and 5 or 6 destroyers. That's an interesting one. I mean, the second Battle of Narvik, when Warburton Lee's flotilla goes in, you can pretty much replicate with the Swedish destroyers, so 6 of one, half dozen of another probably goes about the same. The third Battle of Narvik, when historically Warspite and Big Flotilla goes in, if you've got now a Sverige, a couple of cruisers, and presumably half a dozen destroyers, that's a bit of an interesting one, I think. The Germans are going to feel a little bit more confident about attacking because there's no Warspite level threat in there, and overall the numbers are slightly down compared to what the British put in. On the other hand, those small cruisers, their guns probably going to be a little bit more useful generally because rapid fire guns. The main thing is going to be how capable are the Swedish destroyers, and overall how experienced are they in this kind of operation. Because with that level of firepower coming in, assuming that you've got the second battle with half a dozen Swedish destroyers going in there, they've got the firepower to clear the Germans out, albeit with probably some losses. It's just going to be a question of, do they have the operational experience to pull it off, or if the Germans have considerably more battle experience, maybe they might pull an edge case win or a draw. But yeah, I would say if you assume roughly equal crew skill, the Swedes will probably pull off the win in both cases, but with slightly higher losses. Whereas if you're going by historical levels of combat experience and training, the Germans have a somewhat better chance of pulling off the maybe not a win, because to be honest, even if they're the last ones left standing, if you've got 2 damaged destroyers and nothing else left standing, you've still lost. But certainly pulling off a decent draw. Blog saying, remember the submarine. Yes, but German torpedoes were doing almost as bad, if not worse, than Mark 14s in that particular engagement. So how much use any of the German subs are with their torpedoes at that point is open to significant question. Brian Roper, going off your anti-aircraft ratings, how would you rate the primary batteries of capital ships in World War in World War II, especially those of the 3 Axis and 4 Allied navies that were in use, not just those that were designed? If you mean main batteries, that's got nothing to do with anti-aircraft guns, because the only ones who are going to be using it as anti-aircraft guns are going to be the Japanese, and we know the Type 3 shells aren't particularly up for all of that. If you mean the heavy AA batteries, then, well, the South Dakotas and Iowas are by far and away the winners, because, the winner of the light category is the Orlik, and the winner of the medium category is the Beaufort, the winner of the heavy category is the 5-inch 38, and the Iowas and the South Dakotas are absolutely covered in all 3. Then beyond that, you've got a few weird ones, because the Japanese on some of their ships, like the Yamato, the Japanese win the prize for the most anti-aircraft weapons, but they're just not particularly brilliant. The Italians have some pretty nice heavy, medium AA if it's working that day. The Germans, well, the less said about most of their anti-aircraft batteries on their capital ships, the better. They had so much potential that they ended up just wasting. So yeah, it's going to be the Americans and then followed by the British, because they've got Orlikans and Bofors as well in fairly large numbers. They've got pom-poms on 5.25s, in some cases 4.5s. So it's like Renown's anti-aircraft battery probably actually is slightly more effective than a King George V's. The Soviets, well, by the time anti-aircraft batteries really come into their own, they don't really have any operational capital ships. So certainly none that are going anywhere fast. But yeah, it's for the Allies, it's fairly obvious. Iowas and South Dakotas, and then going further down the line into British ships. For the Axis, I'd say on a good day when all the guns are working, the Italians have probably got a slightly superior AA battery at the times they're involved in the war than the Japanese have, but the Italians aren't in the war by the end. So the Japanese kind of win that by default. Even if the Japanese guns aren't very good, they still have an awful lot of them, especially on Yamato. Nicholas Rassar. Chaos-minded entity offers to send you 10 ships from history, fully and competently crewed, back to the Battle of Jutland. Presumably you're helping the British win harder, has some long-term benefit, so which 10 ships will you take? That's fairly easy. The Iowas, Vanguard. Might as well take the Alaskas and Guams. They're not going to be sailing close enough for anyone to really hit them hard. So you've got Alaska, Guam, the 4 Iowas, Vanguard. So that's 7. Who else would I take? Take the 3 Des Moines, just for laughs. So yeah, 3 Des Moines, Alaska, Guam, Iowas, and Vanguard. And then at that point you've got a squadron that's all capable of over 30 knots, all has the top of the range radar guided gunfire systems. No one's going to know what hit them, and also they can't run away. Brian Roper says, oh, right, so the question was about a rating system, but based on main battery guns. Right, okay, so you're asking basically who had the best main battery guns on a similar rating system. Right, that makes a bit more sense. See, the problem is there's lots of qualifiers involved with that, because if you're just looking at the guns themselves, it's a very different issue to when you're looking at the system as a whole. Because if you're looking at just the guns, then the top 2 spots are probably going to be the Japanese 18.1 inch and the Italian 15 inch, probably with the 16 inch 50 coming in a close third. But that's just looking at the guns and their theoretical capabilities. Whereas if you actually take into account things like, the fire control system and issues with shells and such like, then that flips things around, and you have like the 16-inch 50s at the top. Vanguard's upgraded 15-inch, assuming that they stick the superchargers in, are probably up there as well. And you'll suddenly see the Italian guns drop way off because, of the shell quality issues, and the Japanese, the 18.1 inch, it won't drop tremendously far, but it will drop probably out of the medal positions purely because there's so many other decent naval main battery guns in there that have access to full-on radar fire control. So yeah, I think at some point maybe I should do a video like that, where I'm rating the various main battery guns, but I'd have to think about are we rating them purely as guns, or are we rating them in context of fire control and other specific issues as well? Because Classe Cornate asks, if battlecruiser Goeben had been Deus Ex Machina off the Japanese coast in 1914, say showing off its build quality to the Republic of China from Tsingtao, and the only thing the Japanese could meet them with are 2 Izumo-class quote-unquote battlecruisers, how would the Izumos live up to the name or just die horribly? The Izumos are armoured cruisers, so they would just die horribly. I think you're thinking of a similar Japanese class that also begins with I, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just going to look that up because I know the Izumo class were just normal armoured cruisers, so that would be very, very bad. Yeah, so the Izumo class, couple of 8-inch guns, 4 couple of 8-inch guns after, they're going to just die horribly. Then you've got various Japanese cruisers, and then you have, not them, definitely, Ibukis, that's the ones. I think you're thinking of the Ibukis, which have a couple of 12-inch guns for, a couple of 12-inch guns aft, and a bunch of 8-inch. So at that point, they actually have slightly, I don't know, about the same level of firepower combined. Yeah, so if it's the Izumos, they just die horribly because they're just older armoured cruisers. If it's the 2 Ibukis, they're probably still going to die, but it's going to be a lot closer fight. They've got the firepower to hurt Goeben, and there are 2 of them, so one of them will probably be unengaged, but their armour's not particularly brilliant, and their speed is significantly slower than Goeben. So Goeben can basically kite one and pick one off, and then go back for the other one. So it'd be a fairly close fight, and if the Ibukis land a few decent 12-inch hits, that could really put the hurt on Goeben. But it is kind of Goeben's fight to lose. Why is that in the... I don't think that is in... That should have been in alternate history. James Cuff, if you are listening, I think your question is actually in the main one, the main Drydock that's going to be released on Sunday. If it isn't, please get in touch with me. Admiral Tiberius, could you tell us how you got the idea to start the channel? Was it something you thought about and quickly got started up, or did it take time? Okay, so I think I've told some people this before. I don't know if I've told the entire channel this before, but the original idea behind the channel, weirdly enough, was probably a little bit self-defeating, in as much as back in, I think, 2015, 2016, I was working for Transport for London. And for those of you who don't know London, that and such like that basically means that I had to commute into London for about an hour, hour and a half each day on a packed commuter train, which more closely resembles a very large red-painted sardine can. So you can't read books on a commuter train in the morning. There just is not the space. You can't barely do anything else. And with an hour and a half each way, so 2 to 3 hours each day, there's only so much music you can listen to before it starts to get repetitive. But I was lucky enough, I had an unlimited data plan, so I could watch, or more accurately probably listen to half the time, YouTube videos. And I thought, right, I'll listen to stuff I have an interest in. But even then, you know, 2 to 3 hours each day, you run through content quite quickly. And so I decided that I was going to try and find some longer form stuff about naval history, because, you know, I like naval history, shockingly enough. And I started looking, and bear in mind this is 2016-ish, and I found that there were channels that did some really good naval history content, but either their output was relatively low, or their channel didn't focus just on naval history. It focused on a lot of other military history, which was interesting, but, you know, it wasn't the naval history fix I was looking for, because if I could listen to sort of a 20-minute video once every 4 weeks, well, there's a lot of commuting time in there where I wasn't going to be listening to something interesting. There were a few channels that were doing a bit more regular naval content, but for those ones where you're sort of getting at least 1 or 2 videos a week, let's just say I wasn't particularly impressed. And so I was left with the quandary of, well, there isn't content on the of the amount and of the quality that I want to listen to. So eventually I decided, well, enough mentally moaning about it, I'm just going to have to go and do it yourself. Which is kind of self-defeating, because the whole point of initially was I wanted to listen to stuff on the train, and now I found myself making stuff for other people to listen to on the train, which didn't actually solve the original problem of I still didn't have stuff to listen to on the train. That's how I eventually ended up getting into audiobooks, but listening to audiobooks. But that's basically why I ended up starting the channel. And yeah, it took me a few months to think about, should I do it, should I not? Got started and found I liked it, and it's kind of just gone since then. Yeah. In some ways, I sometimes joke I've started the channel mainly out of spite, because I just wanted there to be a half-decent naval history channel, dedicated naval history channel. Because I say, there was in 2016, like, Military History Visualized was going at that point, and his naval stuff is pretty top-notch, but obviously he doesn't specialize in naval history. So while I quite happily listened to all his videos, I wasn't getting a regular naval history fix from him. So certainly not on the scale that I needed for surviving the London commute. Boy, that takes it out of you. Salty Viking 10,022. If the Soviet Union became a true ally of Germany, what sort of navy could you see being built with Russian resources and German plus Russian ship designers working together? Probably not a tremendous amount more than was historically built, because you need the economy of and the political driving power to build up those navies. And, you know, Stalin was trying to build up the Soviet Navy. Hitler was trying to build up the German Navy. They were going about as flat out as their economies would allow, and combining their economies just means maybe slightly saner building schedules. But you're still going to end up with World War II starting with roughly those kinds of sizes of fleets. Maybe some of the Russian stuff would get finished a little bit quicker, because the design work and the initial construction expertise would be going a little bit faster, but there are limits on how many shipyards there are. Now the big question is, of course, whether or not the Soviets and the Germans go to war and what happens there, but that's a much bigger butterfly. It'll probably overall benefit the Soviets considerably more, because they have a lot more to catch up on. The German shipbuilding industry, such as it was almost pretty much flat out building up the Kriegsmarine, whereas if German shipyard managers and designers and such like had been able to knock the Russian shipyards into shape in 35, they might have gotten a bunch more ships into the water by the time 39 comes round. Yes, Darius Rudkowski, I have many gauntlets. I have about 5 pairs of gauntlets, I think, for different suits of armour. Sky asks, and this is the last Patreon question, then we're on to the Super Chats, which is just as well, because I've got about half an hour before, as I say, I need to skedaddle. Right. Sky, here we go. Sky is asking, if the age of battleships didn't come to an end, do you think battleships would continue to increase in size and armament to become bigger than Yamato or Bismarck? Would they have stopped at a certain size due to cost and crew requirements being too high, assuming no size limiting treaties get signed? Yes, I mean, you would have seen Montana. The main thing is, why is the age of battleships not coming to an end? If there's still aircraft and those threats around, but they decide to build battleships anyway, then you look at like the 1945 British studies for what kind of battleships you need to be survivable in the face of these new threats, and you're talking about a ship that's 1,000 foot long as a starter. So battleships would have to be that size or greater just to carry the protection that they need to survive. So they would be bigger. They would be sort of 80, 90, 100,000 tons, fairly sharpish. At which point, you know, they'd probably stabilize around about that level, because there's not a tremendous amount further you can go beyond that and be practical in terms of expense. I mean, even if you look at supercarriers these days, they're at around just over 100,000 ton odd mark, and there's only so many you can build and only so fast that you can build them. So I think that's all the Patreon questions. So if I'm just going to move that one, which is the one that has the specific to be answered on date. And let's now start rattling through the super chats and then hopefully catch a few questions from the main chat before, as I say, 7:30 hits and I need to get going. Michael O'Brien: had a late war Iowa been in Pearl Harbor during the attack, could their anti-aircraft guns have made a difference? Assuming they're in the same readiness state as everyone else, no. Because the biggest problem for the US wasn't necessarily the lack of anti-aircraft guns, it was the fact no one was actually ready to man them. And you see the Japanese losses racking up higher and higher during the first and second wave attacks as more and more of the anti-aircraft defenses come online. So the bulk of the damage is done relatively early on, and assuming that the I was at the same readiness state as everybody else, you know, maybe some of the lighter guns, the Oerlikons and the Bofors, will start off and cause a few more casualties, but it's broadly not going to affect the outcome. What will happen as everyone gets a bit more alert and guns start firing off is probably the Japanese second wave will sustain much heavier losses overall, but I don't think it's going to massively change the actual outcome of the attack in the first place. Nosdormu, where you gone? There you go. Nosdormu 89. Can you tell me about USS O'Bannon versus RO-34? I can, but that is going to be the subject of a Wednesday video at some point, so I don't want to spoil it too much. If I'm not mistaken off the top of my head, I know I've got O'Bannon versus RO-34 on the cards. I believe that's the one where everyone was throwing potatoes and Coke bottles at the submarine's crew to stop them from manning deck guns and such like. But yeah, that particular engagement is going to be part of a Wednesday video. So yeah, drop me a line via Discord or via email if you'd like another question answered, but I don't want to retread something that's going to be part of a separate video in any significant amount of detail. Sage of Irrelevance asks, Courageous, Glorious and Furious before their conversions to carriers versus the three Deutschlands. Excuse me. The three Deutschlands will probably win that on the grounds that, yes, okay, Courageous, Glorious and Furious are carrying heavier guns, but significantly fewer of them, and you know, whilst neither side has armour to resist the other, the Courageous class are bordering on the edge of actually being functional warships because they're so lightly built. A 15-inch shell hitting a Deutschland is going to cause problems for the Deutschland, no doubt, but a salvo of 11-inch shells hitting Courageous or Glorious, and pretty much, assuming it doesn't just fold over from the fact that the one structural member that's holding the thing together has been broken. Maxim Machine Gun. Have you read Gary Staff's book Skagerrak? He claims there was no German battlecruiser death ride, just sensationalism. After all, no battlecruisers were sunk during or from it. I haven't read it, but if that's the claim, I would strongly disagree with it, because we have multiple sources confirming that it happened. We have Scheer who told them to go in. And we have Hipper, who was the one who was told to go in and received the orders, even if he was somewhat occupied at the time. And you have the British, who saw the battle cruisers come in. The battle cruiser crews, who do distinctly remember being shot at while the rest of the German fleet left. And, yeah, I mean, everyone on both sides agrees the German battle cruisers were sent in to screen the German battle fleet as it made its turn away. Now, granted, yes, there weren't any battle cruisers sunk during or as a result of it, but a lot of them were quite badly chewed up as a result of it. And as I've mentioned before, part of the big problem with the death rate of the German battle cruisers was there were too many British ships. They were smothering the area around the German battle cruisers with fire, but there was so much of it, no one could tell which waterspouts belonged to which ships. And that actually meant that the accuracy level of the shells flung at them was vastly, vastly, vastly less than it could have been. In fact, if Jellicoe had ordered the Grand Fleet at that point to cease fire and just ordered the two nearest battle squadrons to go 2 ships versus every one, or even one battle squadron to go one-on-one, they probably would have done significantly more damage to the German battle cruisers than they did with the entire fleet. Ruben G there saying, can you do a video about the Admiral who lost against Nelson at Trafalgar? Once I manage to get the resources in place to do Nelson Part 3, then sure, but you'll have to tell me whether you mean Villeneuve or Gravina, or both. Because there were 2 fleets facing the British. And Gravina was very much not Villeneuve's subordinate. They were operating together. Packer 910, would the US fleet in 1916 have stood up to the Grand Fleet better than the High Seas Fleet at Jutland? Probably not, because they don't have any battle cruisers to scout for them. I'm just going to check on the number of US battleships, but I'm 99% sure it's less. So they don't have any battle cruisers to scout for them. That's a major problem, because that means that even Beatty can find and fix the American battle fleet. Then you've got the additional problem of whether or not you're taking the South Carolinas. The US historically derated the South Carolinas down to operating with the pre-dreadnoughts because of their speed issues. The problem is if you do take them, you then give the British a massive speed advantage. If you don't take them, it's 2 less battleships. But assuming they don't, because they want to be able to operate at least 21 knots, you've got 2 Delawares, 2 Floridas, 2 Wyomings, so that's 6 12-inch gun ships. You've got Texas and New York, so that's up to 8 ships. You've then got Nevada and Oklahoma, only just in commission. So you've got 10 battleships, of which you've got 2 standards and Texas and New York just kind of doing the halfway bit, because the Pennsylvanias aren't in commission yet. So you've got 10 battleships and no battle cruisers. That's never going to work better than the Germans, who had considerably more dreadnoughts and an actual battle cruiser squadron. So yeah, that's, and as I've said before, no modern cruisers, virtually no destroyers, no fleet screen. The British can attack with anything and everything at that point. Michael O'Brien asks, it's June 38 and Congress has decided to throw the US Navy a bone. You've been tasked with overhauling one aspect of the Navy. Which one do you choose? Bureau of Ordnance. Instant. Easy. Easily done. Haul over the Bureau of Ordnance, get the Mark 14s fixed, get the 64 other issues the Bureau of Ordnance caused fixed, and the US Navy will be thanking you left, right and centre for the rest of the war, because they'll actually be able to use half the systems that they are supposed to be able to use. Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. If for some magical reason I'm not allowed to overhaul that element of things, then the next element of the US Navy I would overhaul would be night fighting. It's tempting to say the air wings for the Devastators, because those guys are going to get chewed up quite badly, but tragic as it is for those pilots, the loss of the Devastator squadrons doesn't manifestly affect the course of the war particularly, or really affect the loss of that many ships. Whereas getting a coherent and useful night fighting doctrine drummed into the US Navy's heads before the outbreak of war might save an awful lot of people in the Guadalcanal campaign. Sean King 59, were there any cases of cruiser grade weapons on destroyers? Yes, kind of. Some of the German destroyers in World War II mounted 5.9-inch guns, which are light cruiser weapons, effectively. And depending on how far you go with cruiser weapons, given the Didos are generally considered to be full-on cruisers, if somewhat light, some of the French destroyers had weapons in approximately that kind of caliber. And even in World War I, there were a couple of experiments where a few British destroyers were cruising around with a single 6-inch gun aboard. Didn't really work that well, but it was there regardless. So, yeah, there are a few cases of destroyers in World War I and World War II who are rocking around with 5.9 or 6-inch weapons, but nothing much greater than that. Past that, in the Cold War era, they do try and equip a recoilless 8-inch gun on some destroyers, but that's a bit after my time in terms of history coverage. Grimtooth asks, what is the most bombastic, over-the-top and ridiculous you can come up with name for a Royal Navy ship along the lines of HMS Excessive Force? It depends. Are you asking me to invent one, or are you asking me to name one from history? Because if you want historical ones, you've got some pretty strong contenders. I mean, there's several HMS Arrogance, which is, just a fraction over the top, even for the Royal Navy in the Victorian period. I mean, Sovereign of the Seas is pretty up there, to be perfectly honest. At the time that she was built, with her size and firepower, and where the Royal Navy sat in the grand scheme of things, it was probably just about justifiable and trying to make it stick. A lot of it depends on when you're naming the ship, because to be honest, in the late 19th century, you could name a Royal Navy ship almost anything, and whilst it might be ridiculous and over the top, it's not necessarily entirely unjustified. Whereas if you say to, I don't know, go for something like the Royal Navy these days, whilst it is a very elite fighting force and has a bunch of really good ships, with navies the size of the US Navy and the Chinese Navy around, if you were going to try and name a Royal Navy ship Sovereign of the Seas these days, that would be a lot more over the top and ridiculous than it was at the time the original Sovereign of the Seas was launched, unless of course they take up my idea for a Type 83. Dom Hen, USS Johnston equipped with 20 nuclear 5-inch shells at the Battle of Samar. What happens? Everybody dies because they have no idea what the minimum blast radius is, and some of the fighting they engaged in, they're going to blow themselves up as well as everybody else. It'd be very entertaining when the first salvo of 5-inch nuclear shells lands and everyone's trying to figure out what the heck just happened. But yeah, that's just going to kind of be a mutual kill scenario. That's to be honest, I don't even know if you can get a nuclear 5-inch shell, but I'm assuming that we're assuming for the sake of argument that you can. It seems a bit small to me, but nevertheless, I'm not a nuclear physicist. Ninja X Alpaca asks, if all North Carolinas and South Dakotas were sent to the Pacific immediately instead of to the Atlantic post-commissioning, would this have had an effect on the naval battles of Guadalcanal? Would they have participated in the battles? Well, of course, Washington was there. South Dakota was pretty much brought there almost immediately. North Carolina would have been there, but had a bad case of torpedo, which sent it back into Drydock for a while. So, yeah, no, if they'd been sent to the Pacific, I don't think they would have had any major effect on the naval battles of Guadalcanal, because you had Washington and South Dakota running around as playing anti-aircraft escort for a while in the early part of the campaign, but they're not going to send battleships in for, say, the first Battle of Savo Island or the Battle of Cape Esperance. The Washington and South Dakota going in for the second night action was because they were literally out of ships, that Halsey had nothing else that he could send without starting to strip his aircraft carriers of their minimum number of viable escorts. So, you know, they're there when they're needed, and if they'd been there before, they would have just sat being carrier escorts, and they're not going to be committed whilst the US still has cruisers. Nosdormu89, in your opinion, both as an engineer and a naval historian, which is the most bizarre warship design that was fairly successful? In terms of engineering bizarreness, the Popovs have to take the biscuit. I mean, circular warships, and as I covered in the video, they were actually reasonably successful. They had issues, to be fair. They were not 100% successful, but they're a lot more successful than sort of pop culture meme history likes to make out. Yeah, so from an engineering perspective, there's that. The Scorpion and Wyvern, the two rams that were built for the Confederate Navy and then got taken over by the Royal Navy, I just can't get over the idea that you've basically got ship, and then the ship kind of ends, and then there's this raft with turrets on it, and then the stern is also kind of a normal ship. It's basically a ship where someone's taken the MS Paint eraser cube and just gone whoop in the middle with a few fold-down bulwarks, so it doesn't look quite as bad in normal weather. But by and large, they were overall relatively successful. I think those two really compete for properly bizarre warships designs. Colin Cameron asks, Churchill's first Sea Lord forces through the Seafire and carrier Mosquito ready for early 1941. How does this affect UK carrier operation and design? It's probably going to help in the Mediterranean quite a bit, the Seafire certainly, because the performance of the Seafire would let it do more and better interceptions than the Fulmar, so that's definitely going to help. Where you're going to fit a Sea Mosquito, I don't know, but you can. I mean, it's going to give the Royal Navy a quantum leap in torpedo bomber operations, even if they don't have quite the same numbers, considering the speed that those things can go at, and the firepower as well. I mean, Sea Mosquitoes would be a bit of a game changer, as I say, because if you're deploying them in large numbers, especially if you're equipping them with radar, they can go further, faster, and hit harder than the Swordfish can. The main disadvantage, you can't fit as many of them on, but it would also mean that maybe the highball tests would have a little bit more impetus and would be quicker to deploy as well. So you might see highball used towards the end of the war in practicality. But, I mean, early 41, technically, if you really want to get difficult, technically that could mean if they're deployed early enough in the right ships, you could even see Sea Mosquitoes going after Bismarck, which would be quite the fun times. Packer 910. How would a 12-hour warning have affected the outcome of Pearl Harbor? I've read that it might be worse for the US because their ships would have been lost in deeper water. It depends what the US decides to do. If they decide to sail the battle fleet, then yeah, it could have ended worse, because you're going to end up losing even more lives, and ships will be irrecoverably lost when the Kido Butai pounces, because once they're out of Pearl Harbor, sorry, but December 7th, 1941 shipboard AA for the US Pacific Fleet is not going to stop the Kido Butai. And theoretically you might get some US Army Air Force air cover, but you know, cooperation at that point is even if they want to cooperate, which they probably will, but even in that radio cover and fighter direction just isn't there. And also it means the Japanese have a set of targets to concentrate against rather than wasting torpedoes on something like Utah. So yeah, that would end much worse, but the US doesn't necessarily need to sail. If they've got 12-hour warning that the Japanese are about to attack, they may very well just, turtle up, man all the anti-aircraft batteries, and have fighters just buzzing around the harbour. That might end a lot better, because obviously they strongly counter the first wave, and that might even dissuade the Japanese from the second wave, or if the second wave does go in, it'll be much less successful, as will the first wave, because they're being disrupted and shot down. Dr. Covell asks, considering the nature of the US Navy post-World War II, if Rickover hadn't been there, do you think the Russians would have launched a nuke sub first? Unfortunately, while I have some idea of what Rickover did, it is post-1950, it's not my area of study. I could point to the fact like the Russians technically won a lot of the early stages of the space race, like first satellite into space, first man into space, etc. Maybe they get the first nuke sub into the sea as well, but I just don't know enough about that time of history to give you an answer that I could sort of go hand on heart. I'm fairly sure this is what would happen. Box Ghost 102, if planes are never invented, how do secondary batteries develop with torpedo boats as the smallest threat remaining? Probably far more numerous, because you don't need the weight and space taken up by lightweight AA, and probably, and everyone can kind of give up on, oh, do we need 5-inch, do we need 5.25, do we need 4, do we need 4.5, everyone's going, no, 6-inch. Because it's the largest caliber quick-firing gun that they've got at the time, and they want to hit destroyers as hard as possible. So 155mm, 152mm, 6-inch, 6.1-inch, whatever, 5.9-inch, whatever. That will be the caliber of the secondary battery, and it will be uniform, and because they don't need to worry about dual-purpose weapons, the mounts theoretically will be lighter, so there'll be a lot more of them. Animal 16365, Drac, you've just built your very own battleship. You get to arm it with all but the light anti-aircraft guns. For the light anti-aircraft guns, you're forced to choose between the Japanese 25mm or the US Navy 1.1-inch. Ouch. You must not like me. I would probably go with the 1.1 because, problems with jamming, etc., similar across the board. The 1.1-inch hits slightly harder, goes slightly further, and whilst they did replace it with the 20mm and the 40mm, they were also working towards resolving some of its issues around the time that it was replaced, whereas the 25mm got all the way to the end of the war with a bunch of fairly nasty issues still in place. We are skating very close to time. Sorry, I have to get going at 7:30, otherwise I'm going to be in a bit of trouble. Raymond Leone asks, I have a fun question for you. What is your opinion of the captain of the Costa Concordia? Unprintable. The guy manages to get his ship keeling over and then runs away without effectively managing an evacuation. Yeah, I'm not a ship captain. I'm pretty sure I could have done a better job than him. For a start, I wouldn't have been dumb enough to take a sort of tens of thousands of tons of cruise ship that close to an island, because I'm not a complete idiot. But yeah, other than that, insert many unprintable expletives here. Thomas Hobarth, why was the Russian Navy, especially the 2nd Pacific Squadron, in such a sorry state at the beginning of the 20th century? Some of the Russian Navy wasn't, but the 2nd Pacific Squadron was made up basically of older cast-off ships and brand new ships. The kind of relatively new but having been properly worked up ships were all in the 1st Pacific Squadron for all the good that did them. But it was also partly funding, priorities, social unrest at the time, and the way that the Russians manned their ships at the time, take a lot of the conscripts being taken in from areas that they had no idea of the sea, let alone how to man a capital ship. That's not to say the Russian Navy was entirely bad. The fighting efficiency of the 2nd Pacific Squadron went up massively from Dogger Bank, where the only thing they could hit was each other, to Tsushima, where they actually landed a fair number of hits on the Japanese, just not enough, and the shells weren't powerful enough. They could get good if they had enough time and the right kind of taskmasters. It's just they had a lot of hurdles to overcome, and the Japanese were pretty darn good to start with. Jesse Estrada, when did sanitation get implemented on naval ships? And was it spurred on by developments in medicine, or was it based on crew comfort? Very early on, like way back, sanitation on naval ships. Basically because, people aren't stupid. They may not have had germ theory to guide what they were doing, but it didn't take a genius to work out, have a lot of waste and stuff on board ships and people get sick and die. Don't have the waste on the ships and people don't get sick and die quite as much. So they figured out most of the elements of sanitation on ships pretty darn quickly. Certainly sort of Roman Middle Ages ships and such, like, yes, you had rats and yes, you had bad food and that kind of stuff, but in terms of keeping the ship generally cleanish and disposing of waste and such, it's based on survival instinct, and it happens pretty early on. And that is all the super chat questions. We've just hit 7:30. So I am going to have to bid you adieu. Unfortunately, I do apologise for that, but I will try and make it up to you. I'm going to, when we do our mid-month live stream, so that'll be on Saturday the 17th of July, I will start an hour early, so I'll start at 6, so that we have the ability to take a lot more questions. And I'll rest my voice all day in advance, so hopefully my voice will last longer. So we'll do an even longer stream in a couple of weeks on Saturday, in order to make up for the fact that, unfortunately, I do need to run pretty much now. So very sorry about that, everyone, but, such is life, and I shall see you around. Frank Sposato, I will look up whatever this USS Beetlejuice thing is and see what it is. But other than that, see you around, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and see you in another video.